James Wilson walked slowly to his mailbox on a warm Thursday morning. The 72-year-old man moved with a slight limp, a reminder of wounds from long ago. His simple brick house sat on a quiet street in Riverdale, a small town where he had lived for the past 15 years. As he opened the mailbox, Mrs. Parker from next door waved at him. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Beautiful day, isn't it?" James smiled and nodded. "Indeed it is, ma'am. Perfect for my garden." The neighbors all liked James. He was polite, kept to himself mostly, but always ready to help when someone needed it. What most people in town didn't know was that behind his gentle smile and simple life was a man with an extraordinary past. In his living room, pictures told his story. James in a crisp military uniform standing tall. James shaking hands with important people. James receiving medals. But these photos sat on shelves that visitors rarely saw. James didn't talk much about those days. After checking his mail, James went back inside and made himself a cup of coffee. Today was Thursday, which meant it was Veterans Center Day. Twice a week, he volunteered there, helping other veterans with paperwork, and sometimes just listening to their stories. James put on a clean button-up shirt and his favorite navy blue cap that simply said veteran on it. He didn't wear the fancy caps that showed his rank or special service. That wasn't his style. "Time to go help some folks," he said to himself as he grabbed his car keys. The drive to the Veterans Center took 15 minutes. James knew every turn by heart. As he drove, he thought about the young man he was helping this week, a 25-year-old who had just returned from overseas with both physical and mental scars. "He reminds me of myself, many years ago," James thought. At the center, people greeted him with respect. "Morning, Colonel," said Frank, another volunteer. James smiled. "Just James here, Frank. You know that." But everyone knew who he really was. Colonel James Wilson had served for 30 years in the military. He had fought in Vietnam, earning a Purple Heart when he was badly wounded while saving 3 other soldiers. Later, he had worked at the Pentagon, advising generals and even meeting with 2 presidents. His leadership had saved many lives and improved military policies. But now, in his quiet retirement, few people outside the Veterans Center knew this history. To most people in town, he was just Mr. Wilson, the nice old man who grew beautiful roses and sometimes helped kids with their math homework. At the center, James sat down with young Kevin, the veteran he was helping. "How are you feeling today?" James asked gently. "Not great, sir. The nightmares still come," Kevin said, looking down. James nodded. "They might for a while, but we'll get you the help you need." For the next 2 hours, James helped Kevin fill out forms for medical benefits and listened as the young man talked about his struggles. James understood in a way that few others could. When their session ended, Kevin stood up and shook James's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. The guys told me you were important in the military, but you don't act like it." James smiled. "We're all just people trying our best, son." As James drove home that afternoon, he felt good about the day's work. He stopped at the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. Little did he know that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would test his dignity and... The next day began like any other for James. He woke up at 6:30 a.m., made his bed with military precision, and did his morning stretches to help with his old injuries. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he decided to visit his friend Bill at the hospital. Bill Parker, a fellow veteran, had been admitted 3 days ago after falling in his home. At 75, Bill was having a harder time getting around, and James wanted to check on him. Just a quick visit, James told himself as he put on a clean blue shirt and khaki pants. He grabbed a small gift bag containing Bill's favorite peppermint candies and a new mystery novel. James got into his 2010 Ford Sedan. The car wasn't fancy, but James kept it clean and well maintained. He turned the key and frowned when he heard a strange noise. The car started, but something didn't sound right. "I should get that checked soon," he thought. The hospital was across town, about 20 minutes away. James drove carefully, always obeying the speed limit. As he approached a 4-way stop, he came to a complete halt and looked both ways before proceeding. The visit with Bill went well. His friend was in good spirits despite the broken hip. "Doctors say I'll be out of here in a week," Bill said cheerfully. "Then physical therapy for a while." James stayed for an hour, sharing stories and catching up. When he left, dark clouds were gathering in the sky. He hurried to his car, hoping to get home before the rain started. Halfway home, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. James turned on his wipers and slowed down even more. The rain quickly became a downpour, making it difficult to see the road clearly. As James turned onto Maple Street, he noticed flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. He carefully pulled over to the right side of the road, making sure he was completely off the street. He turned off the radio and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. These were habits he had developed over the years, ways to stay safe during traffic stops. As a black man who had lived through the civil rights era, James knew these small actions could make a difference. The police car stopped behind him, and James waited patiently. Through his side mirror, he could see an officer stepping out. The man was white, around 40 years old, with a stocky build. Even through the rain, James could see the officer's face looked stern and unfriendly. Officer Michael Brennan approached the car slowly, one hand resting near his gun. The rain had soaked his uniform within seconds. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with a greeting. "Yes, sir," James replied calmly. "My license is in my wallet, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." James moved slowly and deliberately, first retrieving his wallet from his back pocket, then carefully opening the glove compartment for the registration. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Brennan asked, his tone sharp. "No, sir, I don't," James answered respectfully. "Your right taillight is out, and you were driving too slow for this road." James was surprised about the taillight. "I didn't know about the light, sir. I'll get it fixed right away. As for my speed, I was being careful because of the heavy rain." Officer Brennan's expression hardened. "I don't need excuses." He snatched the documents from James's hand. "Stay in the vehicle." As the officer walked back to his patrol car, James sat quietly, rain drumming on the roof. He had been pulled over before, but something about this officer's attitude made him uneasy. James didn't know it yet, but this routine traffic stop was about to become much more than a simple warning about a broken taillight. James sat patiently in his car, rain streaming down the windows. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The waiting made him uncomfortable, but he remained calm. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Brennan in his patrol car, talking on his radio. Finally, after 15 minutes, Officer Brennan returned, still looking angry despite finding no issues with James's documents. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, not bothering to shield James from the pouring rain. James was confused but complied immediately. "May I ask why, officer?" "Don't question me," Brennan snapped. "Just do as I say." James carefully opened his door and stepped out into the downpour. Within seconds, his clothes were soaked through. The rain was cold, and it made his old leg injury ache. Still, he stood straight, hands visible at his sides. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," Brennan commanded. James did as he was told. The situation was becoming increasingly concerning, but he knew from experience that arguing would only make things worse. "Is there a problem with my paperwork, sir?" James asked politely. "You people always think you know better, don't you?" Brennan said, his voice filled with disgust. "I said no questions, boy." The word hit James like a physical blow. At 72 years old, with gray hair and decades of service to his country, being called boy was deeply disrespectful. It was a term with an ugly history, one that James had heard too many times in his life. "Sir, I'm a senior citizen," James said quietly. "I would appreciate being addressed properly." This seemed to anger Brennan even more. "Oh, you want special treatment? Think you're somebody important?" Brennan roughly patted James down, checking his pockets and sides with unnecessary force. James winced as the officer pressed hard on his bad hip, but he remained silent. By now, a few cars had slowed down to watch what was happening. An elderly black man being searched in the pouring rain by an aggressive officer made for an unsettling scene. "What's in your trunk?" Brennan demanded. "Just some groceries and a small gift bag for my friend in the hospital," James answered truthfully. "Open it." James carefully moved to the back of his car and opened the trunk. Inside were indeed just a few grocery bags and the small gift he had brought for Bill. Brennan roughly pushed the items around, searching for something, anything. Finding nothing suspicious, he seemed even more frustrated. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. "The hospital, sir. I was visiting a friend." "And before that?" I was at home. Don't get smart with me, Brennan warned, stepping closer to James. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. This was a lie, and James suspected as much. It was an excuse he had heard before. Sir, I'm a 72-year-old man with a bad hip. I was just visiting my sick friend, James said calmly. A car slowed down and stopped across the street. A young woman inside was holding up her phone, clearly recording the scene. Officer Brennan noticed and hesitated slightly. Get back in your car, he ordered James, suddenly aware of the witness. James was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his thin frame. He moved slowly back to the driver's side, pain evident in his walk. I'm going to let you go with a warning this time, Brennan said loudly, now conscious of being recorded. Get that taillight fixed immediately. Yes, sir, James replied, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. As James settled back into his seat, Brennan leaned down to the window and spoke quietly, making sure the bystander couldn't hear. Consider yourself lucky today, old man. Next time, show some proper respect when an officer stops you. James said nothing. He simply looked straight ahead, waiting for permission to leave. You can go, Brennan finally said, stepping back from the car. James started his engine, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from controlled anger and the cold brain. As he carefully pulled away, he had no idea that the encounter was far from over. James drove home slowly, his wet clothes making the car seat damp. His hands still shook slightly on the steering wheel. The encounter with Officer Brennan had upset him more than he wanted to admit. Keep it together, old man, he told himself. You've faced worse. When he arrived home, James changed into dry clothes and made himself a hot cup of tea to warm up. He sat in his favorite armchair, trying to calm his nerves. The rain continued to drum against his windows. The phone rang, startling him. Hello, James answered. Mr. Wilson, this is Sarah Johnson. I was driving by when that officer had you standing in the rain. I recorded the whole thing. Are you okay? James recognized her name. Sarah was a teacher at the local high school where he occasionally spoke to students about history. I'm fine, Ms. Johnson. Thank you for your concern. What he did wasn't right, Sarah said firmly. I've already sent the video to my cousin who works at the local news station, and I posted it online. James felt a mix of emotions. He hadn't planned on making a big deal of the incident, but perhaps it needed attention. I appreciate you looking out for me, he said finally. After hanging up, James's phone began ringing repeatedly. Word was spreading fast. By evening, 3 local news stations had called asking for interviews. James declined them all. He wasn't looking for attention or trouble. The next morning, James woke up to find his story had gone viral overnight. The video showed clearly how Officer Brennan had treated him disrespectfully, making him stand in pouring rain while searching his car for no good reason. As James was making breakfast, there was a knock. 3 days after the incident, James sat in the mayor's office, uncomfortable with all the attention. Mayor Garcia, a woman in her 50s with a serious expression, welcomed him warmly. Colonel Wilson, thank you for coming, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Just James is fine, Mayor, he replied quietly. The mayor nodded and continued. The video of your encounter with Officer Brennan has over 2 million views now. People across the country are talking about it. James shifted in his seat. I never wanted to be on the news. I understand, Mayor Garcia said. But sometimes these things happen for a reason. The city council held an emergency meeting yesterday. We want to address what happened properly. Before James could respond, there was a knock at the door. A young police officer entered, looking nervous. Officer Taylor reporting as requested, Mayor, he said, standing at attention when he noticed James. Thank you for coming, the mayor said. Please have a seat. Colonel Wilson, this is Officer David Taylor. He has something important to share. The young officer, probably in his late 20s, sat down hesitantly. He looked directly at James. Sir, I wanted to apologize, Officer Taylor began. I was the backup officer called to the scene that day, but I arrived after Officer Brennan had already let you go. If I had gotten there sooner, I would have intervened. James studied the young man. How do you know that? Officer Taylor straightened his back. Because I recognized you immediately, sir. You spoke at my police academy graduation 2 years ago. Your speech about integrity and community service is why I became an officer. This surprised James. He had given many talks over the years, but hadn't expected to be remembered. There's more, Taylor continued. When I saw the dashcam footage and realized how Brennan had treated you, I was the one who brought it to Chief Roberts' attention. I couldn't stay silent. The mayor nodded approvingly. Officer Taylor risked his standing among fellow officers to report misconduct. That takes courage. James felt a new respect for the young officer. Thank you for doing the right thing. The right thing is what I wanted to discuss, Mayor Garcia said, bringing the conversation back to its purpose. We're organizing a town hall meeting tomorrow. The community is demanding answers about police conduct. We'd like you both to attend. James hesitated. What about Officer Brennan? He'll be there, the mayor confirmed. He's been suspended but has agreed to attend. The chief insisted. Officer Taylor looked uncomfortable. Sir, many officers are taking sides. Some defend Brennan, saying he was just doing his job. Others are as outraged as I am. It's creating tension in the department. James thought for a moment. At 72, he had hoped for a quiet retirement. But perhaps his experience, both good and bad, could help bring about necessary changes. I'll attend on one condition, James finally said. This can't just be about punishing one officer. It needs to be about making real improvements in how police interact with all citizens, especially minorities and the elderly. Mayor Garcia nodded in agreement. That's exactly what we need, someone who can see the bigger picture. As they finalized the details, James's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his friend Bill at the hospital. Saw you on the news. Proud of you for standing up, just like in the old days. James smiled slightly. He hadn't planned to become an activist in his 70s, but sometimes life had other plans. When the meeting ended, Officer Taylor walked James to his car. Sir, may I ask you something? Taylor said hesitantly. Go ahead. How did you stay so calm with Brennan? If someone had talked to me that way. James looked at the young officer thoughtfully. When you've lived as long as I have, son, you learn which battles are worth fighting and how to fight them effectively. Sometimes dignity is your best weapon. As James drove home, he prepared himself mentally for the town hall meeting. It would be difficult, but perhaps necessary, not just for him, but for his community. The community center was packed beyond capacity for the town hall meeting. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. News vans from local stations and even 2 national networks parked outside. James arrived early, wearing his best suit, navy blue with a crisp white shirt. He had debated whether to wear his military medals but decided against it. This wasn't about his achievements. It was about being treated with basic human dignity. Mayor Garcia greeted him at the side entrance to avoid the crowd. Colonel Wilson, thank you for coming. It's going to be tense in there. James nodded. I faced worse. They entered through a back door. The room immediately quieted as people noticed James. Some stood up in respect. Others pointed and whispered. James kept his eyes forward, walking with the straight posture that had become second nature during his military years. At the front of the room was a long table. Chief Roberts sat there, along with several city council members. Officer Taylor stood nearby, looking uncomfortable in the spotlight. And at the far end, sitting alone, was Officer Brennan. The officer looked different today, his uniform replaced by a plain suit, his face drawn and tired. He avoided looking at James. Mayor Garcia began the meeting with a brief statement about community relations and the need for respect. Then she invited James to speak. James walked slowly to the microphone. The room was completely silent. Good evening, he began, his voice steady. My name is James Wilson. 3 days ago, I was pulled over for a broken taillight. What should have been a routine stop became something else. James spoke clearly, describing the events without emotion or exaggeration. He didn't need to embellish. The facts were damning enough. I'm not here to demand Officer Brennan lose his job, James continued, surprising many. I'm here because what happened to me happens to many people who don't have the advantage of a viral video or a distinguished service record. Several people nodded in agreement. Some called out, that's right. I served this country for 30 years, James said. I did so believing in certain principles, dignity, respect, and equal treatment under the law. These aren't just military values. They're American values. The audience applauded. James raised his hand for quiet. What I want is simple: training for officers to treat all citizens with respect, regardless of age or race. Clear consequences when that doesn't happen, and open dialogue between police and the communities they serve. When James finished, the room erupted in applause. As he returned to his seat, many people reached out to touch his shoulder or shake his hand. Next, Chief Roberts spoke, announcing new training programs and a review of department policies. Officer Taylor briefly described how officers could better approach traffic stops. Then it was Officer Brennan's turn. He walked slowly to the microphone, looking nervous. The room grew tense. He began, then stopped. He looked directly at James for the first time. I was wrong. The simple admission surprised everyone, including James. My behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful, Brennan continued. When I saw who Colonel Wilson really was, I felt ashamed. But the truth is, I should have treated him with respect regardless of who he was. Brennan paused, visibly struggling. I've spent the last few days thinking about why I acted that way. I could make excuses about being stressed or having a bad day, but that wouldn't be honest. The room remained silent, everyone waiting. The honest truth is that I saw an older black man and made assumptions. That's not good policing. It's not even good humanity. Brennan looked directly at James again. I'm sorry, sir. Truly sorry. James nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without necessarily accepting it yet. As the meeting continued with community members asking questions and sharing experiences, James watched Officer Brennan carefully. The man seemed genuinely remorseful. One apology wouldn't fix the larger issues. Real change would require much more work, from everyone. 1 month after the town hall meeting, James sat in a classroom at the police academy. 20 officers, both new recruits and veterans of the force, watched him attentively. Among them was Officer Brennan, required to attend as part of his reinstatement process. Respect isn't just about the words you use, James explained, walking slowly between the desks. It's about how you see the person in front of you. Chief Roberts had asked James to help develop a new training program focused on community relations. After much thought, James had agreed. Today was the first session. When I was a young lieutenant in Vietnam, James continued, I learned that how you speak to people determines whether they trust you or fear you. The same principle applies to policing. Officer Taylor, who had been promoted to help lead the new community outreach unit, nodded in agreement from the back of the room. Let me give you an example, James said. He pulled out 2 short video clips from his traffic stop with Brennan. In this first clip, notice the officer's body language and tone. How would you feel if approached this way? The officers watched uncomfortably as Brennan's aggressive stance and harsh voice played on the screen. No one spoke when it ended. Now, let's look at an alternative approach. James played a reenactment video showing a respectful traffic stop. Same situation, very different outcome. After the videos, James divided the officers into groups for role-playing exercises. He purposely placed Brennan with Taylor, hoping the younger officer's example would help. As James moved between groups, he noticed that many officers seemed genuinely interested in improving. Some shared their own experiences of stops gone wrong. Others asked thoughtful questions about handling difficult situations. When the session ended, most officers thanked James before leaving. Brennan lingered behind, clearly wanting to speak privately. Colonel Wilson, he began hesitantly, I've been wanting to tell you something. James waited patiently. My grandfather was also a military man, Brennan said. He served in Korea. He always taught me to respect veterans. Is that why you feel bad? James asked directly. Because I turned out to be a veteran? Brennan looked down. At first, yes. These past weeks, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about my assumptions and attitudes. And, James prompted, and I realized I would never have treated a white man your age that way. That's a hard truth to face about yourself. Brennan's voice was quiet but steady. James studied the officer carefully. He had seen many men make promises to change over his lifetime. Some meant it. Most didn't. Change takes more than words, Officer Brennan, James said finally. It takes daily choices and self-awareness. I know, Brennan replied. That's why I've enrolled in additional diversity training on my own time. and I've asked to be assigned to community service in predominantly black neighborhoods." This surprised James. Perhaps Brennan was more serious than he had thought. "Small steps, officer. That's how real change happens." As James gathered his materials, Chief Roberts entered the classroom. "How did it go?" the chief asked. "It's a start," James replied honestly. "Some will take it to heart, others won't. But the important thing is that you're trying." Chief Roberts nodded. "The mayor called this morning. Your story has prompted other departments across the state to review their training procedures. They're asking if you consider consulting more widely." James hadn't expected this. At 72, he had planned to spend his remaining years tending his garden and visiting with friends. But perhaps this was important work that needed doing. "I'll think about it," James said. As he drove home that afternoon, James reflected on how a painful incident had opened unexpected doors. Throughout his life, he had seen how even negative experiences could lead to positive change when approached with wisdom and determination. The work ahead would be challenging, but if it meant fewer people would experience what he had gone through, perhaps it was worth the effort. 6 months had passed since that rainy day when Officer Brennan pulled James over. The small town of Riverdale had changed in subtle but important ways. James sat on a bench in the town park, watching children play. The fall leaves created a colorful carpet around him. At 73 now, he felt the slight chill more deeply in his bones, but his mind remained sharp. "May I join you?" a voice asked. James looked up to see Sarah Johnson, the teacher who had recorded the video that changed everything. "Please do," James said, smiling. Sarah sat beside him. "I saw the news this morning. The state legislature passed the Respect in Policing Act. They're calling it the Wilson Act unofficially." James nodded. "So I heard. I'm not sure how I feel about having my name attached to it." "You should be proud," Sarah insisted. "Because of you, police across the state will receive better training. Body cameras are mandatory now, and citizens have clearer ways to report problems." What had begun as a local incident had indeed grown into something much larger. James had spent the past months consulting with police departments in several cities. His military background gave him credibility with officers, while his experience as a black man in America helped him explain realities that some had never considered. "It wasn't just me," James said modestly. "Many people worked hard to make these changes happen." As they talked, a police cruiser pulled up nearby. Officer Taylor stepped out, now wearing the stripes of a sergeant. "Colonel Wilson," Taylor called, walking over. "I thought I might find you here." James had become something of a mentor to the young officer. "What brings you by, Sergeant?" "Good news," Taylor said. "Remember those community meetings you suggested, where officers would sit down regularly with neighborhood residents? We've been doing them for 3 months now." "And?" James prompted. "Complaints are down 40%. People actually wave at our cruisers now instead of looking away." Taylor was clearly proud. "The chief wanted me to tell you personally." As they chatted, another familiar figure approached. Officer Brennan. He looked different somehow. Less rigid, more thoughtful. "Good afternoon," Brennan said, nodding respectfully to everyone. "I'm not interrupting, am I?" "Not at all," James replied. Sergeant Taylor was just sharing some good news. Brennan had indeed changed over the months. After completing his suspension and additional training, he had requested assignment to the Community Outreach Unit. Many had been skeptical, but James had supported giving him the chance. "I have some news too," Brennan said. "I've been accepted to law school. Evening classes. I want to better understand the legal system I'm part of." "That's excellent," James said, genuinely impressed. As the officers continued their patrol, Sarah turned to James. "Do you think Brennan has really changed, or is he just trying to save his career?" James considered the question. People can change when they truly see themselves clearly. It's not easy, and not everyone manages it, but it happens. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they sat together. From across the park, James could see his friend Bill, now recovered from his hip surgery, walking with his grandchildren. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "when I joined the military in 1970, many people didn't believe things would ever change, but they did, slowly, not perfectly, but meaningfully." He watched a young black officer, one of several new recruits, help a lost child find her mother. The woman thanked him with a genuine smile. That's how progress works, James continued. Not in one dramatic moment, but in thousands of small interactions where people choose to do better. Sarah nodded. And it takes people like you to show the way. James stood up, feeling the familiar ache in his hip. I'm just one person doing what seems right. That's all any of us can do. As James walked home, he reflected on his long life. The battles fought on foreign soil, and those fought at home. Some changes took decades. Others happened when you least expected them. What had begun as a humiliating encounter in the rain had become something meaningful, not just for James, but for his community and beyond. That, he decided, was a legacy worth having.